to be in conversation today with Rabbanit Adena Berkowitz, who's going to be teaching us about the Jewish Journey Haggadah that she wrote in time for this holiday. A word about Rabbanit Berkowitz. She's a scholar in residence and co-founder of Kol HaNeshama in New York City. It's an organization dedicated to re-energizing the spiritual lives of both not yet affiliated and affiliated Jews. With a background in law, Jewish studies, and psychotherapy, Adena is the author of the just released The Jewish Journey Haggadah and co-authored together with Rivka Haut, Zichrona Livracha, of Shaarei Simcha, Gates of Joy, a mini prayer book, and the first liturgical Seder edited by Orthodox women in the modern era. A practicing therapist, she lives in New York with her husband, Rabbi Zev Brenner, and children, Menachem Leib, Lizzie, and husband Sam, Pammy, Aderet, and Jessica Brenner. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Rabbanit Berkowitz to tell us more about this Haggadah, why now, and how we can all enrich our Pesach experience and Seders because of it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be part of this JOFA webinar. I'm very honored and excited to reach out to so many people. It's really a wonderful event for me personally. Here is the Jewish Journey Haggadah, which just came out. I'm honored to say it was even profiled in the New York Times on the food section. So that was quite nice. The reason for my writing the Haggadah, I would say, was a feeling that Pesach is that one holiday, probably more than any other holiday, that families find themselves with people around the table of really different backgrounds, different beliefs, being in different stages and their own journey of Jewish life. People could have children that were raised in the Orthodox tradition who perhaps have embraced something, they're more fervent, people who are following a different path of not considering themselves part of the Orthodox community anymore. There's so many different permutations. And it always occurred to me that here you could have a variety of different people around your table. What can they all find meaningful about the Seder? The Seder is a night of asking so many questions, but I always found that there's one question that I particularly do not like. The question that I don't like is the question, which is probably the most popular question, which is, when do we eat? Why don't I particularly like that question? Because that question, listen, I'm like everybody else, especially with daylight savings time. What time do we start our Seder? It's very, very late. By the time we really get to the meal, we can be very famished. But the concern I have with that question is, does that mean that people are not spiritually engaged? That the focus for them, as important as the brisket is and the wonderful side dishes and the delicious desserts, but the focus really has to be on what goes on at the Seder. It's interesting because what we know is that certain things were moved up for fear that children would fall asleep too early in the proceedings and miss the whole Seder. That's a very common question that comes up. Can we start our Seder earlier? Because I'm afraid my little children will fall asleep. And having gone through many different stages of parenting, I said, there's an idea that we should never bribe our children. I said, but you know what? I think on the night of the Sederim, bribery can work. I think you can say, if you cooperate and you take a nap early, you're going to we'll make it a chocolate Seder. At every step of each cup of wine, we're going to give you a chocolate bar. Like, make it one of those little ones that they can save up, or we'll give you some kind of little toy. Something that pedagogically we might not endorse at another time, but it's really within the keeping of examples that we find in the Gemara of how to keep children engaged by giving them nuts, by doing different things. Here too, we really want those kids to stay up. The other thing also that I like to think about is that while we do want to focus on little kids, and there's so many wonderful things people do, there's play kits, people throw little frogs around, there's wonderful masks you can get. I have a lot of suggestions for what parents can do in my Haggadah, ranging from decorating pillowcases to decorating plastic cups with people's names on it, to personalize their wine cup or to personalize their Netilat Yadayim cup. But in a sense, the Pesach Seder is also meant for the inner child. And what I mean by the inner child, in a sense, all of us are children, because we learn that from the Masorah, that even if there's no child at the Seder, we're still obligated to ask the Manishtana. We all have questions. And this is a wonderful time where people should feel free to ask those questions. So I tried to assemble questions for people to ask, things for people to think about, which I hope to bring out in the webinar. But one of the amazing kavanot I came across was something that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who was a great Hasidic rabbi, who saw himself as, in a sense, the defender of the Jewish people before God. He always would say in different scenarios, you know, Ribono Sholem, what do you want from the poor shoemaker? He tries so hard. Give him a break, etc. So he had a kavana that I found the source. It says when Pesach was coming, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev would go and watch the Jewish women toiling, scrubbing, rinsing, and chasing after every crumb of chametz. Then he would lift his eyes to heaven, and just as on Rosh Hashanah, when we ask that the angels that are born of Tekiah, Shavarim, Teruah, and Tekiah, which are the very shofar blasts, should speak on our behalf, he would say, Master of the universe, may it be your will that the angels born of toiling, scrubbing, rinsing, and tidying come before your throne of glory and speak on our behalf. When I read that, I said, you know, what that really tells me is that cleaning for Pesach is not spring cleaning. It's not just about a desire of, oh, we've got too much clutter in our closets, let's get rid of it. Cleaning for Pesach is spiritual work. And because it's spiritual work, we have to remember it's difficult work. Often that work falls on women in the house. Thankfully today we see a more egalitarian attitude about preparing for Pesach, whether it's the cleaning or it's the cooking. So thankfully for that. But we learn in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it says that everybody is trusted with the responsibility of biur chametz, including women. So we know that women are part of this holy work. So that, I think, is something like a hands-on thing when we clean. Whether you're a man or a woman, to think about that it takes on a spiritual work. The other thing that the rabbis also did, which I think was very interesting, was that they said that chametz does not only represent physical leaven products, but it also is symbolic of a spiritual type of yeast, of sourness, of puffery, of pride and arrogance, that they said Pesach is a good time to get rid of ourselves. So some have suggested that as we go around and we put 10 pieces of bread following Kabbalistic custom around the house. I'll just interrupt myself and say that there is a custom to save one's lulav and to use that to sweep in as opposed to a feather, and then it gets burned together with the chametz. But they said that as we search our homes, think of 10 different types of spiritual chametz that we could rid ourselves of. And unlike the edible chametz that we end up wanting to reintroduce ourselves as soon as Pesach's over, let's face it, those lines of those pizza stores that open right after Yontif, those lines are very long. I confess I've been on some of those lines, but they say let's try to keep away from the spiritual chametz. The other interesting thing, and this actually has a JOFA connection because it was really from the JOFA journal through Dr. Yael Levine that I first learned about this, which is we know about the different simanim that go on the Pesach table for the Seder. And of course, probably most of us are familiar. Most recently, one of the new additions has been Kos Miriam, the cup of that is filled with water in honor of Miriam. In my Haggadah, I discuss what could be a possible precedent for that, because some people have asked me, they said, what is the precedent for putting a cup of water in honor of Miriam on? And this was something that I learned about years ago from the JOFA journal and through the work of Dr. Yael Levine and Lisa Schlepp and others, in which they had a source that said in the 10th century, now this is so interesting because it's not the 20th century or the 21st century, but it's the 10th century, the people of Kairovan, which is in North Africa, asked Rav Sharira, who's the Gaon of Pumbedita in Babylonia, Babel, and they asked him regarding the two foods that are placed on the Seder table. What is the meaning of those two foods? And he said that they symbolize the two messengers, Moses and Aaron, whom Hashem sent to Egypt. He told them that there are those who place a third food. And what is the third food? Fish. Fish on the Seder table. And why did he say that some people put fish on the Seder table? He said, L'zecher Miriam, because it says, and I will send before you, this is in Micha, I will send before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. And what we also learn is that tradition teaches us that these three food items, the egg, the meat, and the fish, will be eaten in the world to come, from the Livyaton. So that's, I think, something amazing, because it gives us then a source for something that seems just like a very modern addition. I think it's a wonderful idea to fill a cup of water and to take a moment to really think of heroic people in your life. It's men and women, kind of. I know they have an award, the Nachshon Award, of those people that, like Nachshon, took the first step. But it's also the Miriam Award, because she carried the water. She did the heavy lifting. And the famous Midrash said when she died, the wells dried up, and we need to bring her back. We need to bring that spiritual feeling back. And that's something that the rabbis endorsed. I think another question that comes up about the kind of Seder we want to have is, what is the relevance for people today? One of the things that I tried to do was I tried to evoke experiences of people in more recent times who experienced genocide and who experienced tremendous trauma trying to live lives as Jews. And of course, what comes to mind are people, survivors from the Holocaust, Russian Jews, which is an incredible history that I think it's very important for younger people, millennials and younger, who didn't live through that period, to understand what it meant for Russian Jewry to re-embrace their Jewish identity, and what it meant to practice Judaism in a country where that would send you to prison or for a very long time. I have in the Haggadah a beautiful memory by Natan Sharansky, just talking about that very fact. I also included something about Ethiopian Jews, because it was only about 28 years ago when the last large numbers of Ethiopian Jews arrived in Israel. And one of the shocking factors is that we say at the end of our Seder, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim habenuyah, but I include a story that shows that when these Ethiopian Jews arrived in Israel, they didn't know about Korban Bayit. It was very interesting because there was some doubt about one of the stories. And last spring, I was online getting a cup of coffee in Starbucks, and I was with my youngest daughter, and in front of us were two women that I immediately realized. I said, they're speaking Hebrew. I said, they're Ethiopian. They were from Ethiopia. And I leaned over to them and I said to them, it's so nice to hear such a beautiful Hebrew being spoken. And we struck up a conversation. And after talking to them for a few minutes, I said to them, I'm assuming, did you come originally to Israel from Ethiopia? And they said, yes. I said, I had a question to ask you. When you got to Israel, did you know about Korban Bayit? Did you know that the Beis Hamikdash had been destroyed? And they said to me, no. It really was an incredible moment. I include a story about what was the reaction of Ethiopian Jews when they found out that they couldn't go Pesach to the Beis Hamikdash. They could only go to the Kotel, that they didn't know that it was standing. And those are some of these memories I wanted to preserve. It was important for me to preserve some incredible memories that I found regarding what happened during the Holocaust. And Holocaust survivors, I'll just share with you, is that, a question that people in death camps asked when Pesach rolled around was, what do we do about eating? What are we supposed to do? We can't refrain from eating chametz for a whole week. And what were they eating to begin with? Scraps of bread, watery soup, barely sustained them. So I have in the Haggadah something that I received permission from the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel, from their archive, made it out of Bergen-Belsen. It was written in 1944. It was a prayer that was written by rabbis to say before eating chametz, in which they said it's our intention, really, we want to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of the Torah and eat matzah and stay away from chametz, but we're in mortal danger. And our prayer to you is that you should keep us alive and sustain us so that we'll be able to be redeemed and observe your decrees and serve you wholeheartedly. What a statement that makes about people's emunah and what they were thinking. What were some of the things that they were thinking in the death camp? Just to kind of wrap up this thing about the Holocaust that I found so interesting was the story of a woman, Mrs. Gloria Lyons, who was working in a salt mine where they were working actually on the V-2 rockets. It was deep in the ground. To avoid Allied detection. It was a salt mine. And in the late 1980s, the German government tracked down survivors who had worked there, who were still alive, and invited them to come back for a ceremony. And she came back. It was her first time back, and they were showing her around, and there was an engineer there, based on whatever they were using it at that moment for. And he went over, and it was kind of a salt mine that had stalactite, a type of very pointy pieces of salt. And he went over and he broke off a piece for her. And he said, here's a souvenir. Take it back with you to America. And, you know, we're not talking, this is not Lahavdil Elef Havdalah's souvenir from Disney World. This is a souvenir from a labor camp where death and dying and suffering was present every single day. And she took it back with her. And what do you think she used it for? She used it as the salt every year to go into the water for dipping the karpas at the Seder. Because when we talk about the tears, that it represents the tears of Bnei Israel, of the slaves, that was her firsthand response to it. One of the other interesting things about mentioning about the salt water and dipping in karpas, people have different customs as to what they dip in. Some people dip in parsley, some people dip in potatoes, some people dip in potatoes and parsley, etc. But there's an interesting question that comes up that goes to my first question, which was that where people are going to say, when do we eat? As to how much can one eat at that step of the Seder. It's Rambam, I believe, Maimonides, who says one is not supposed to eat more than a kazayat, like a limited amount, about the size. It's like the size of an olive, maybe the size of an egg. But there are others, such as the Rush and others, who say, no, that is a good opportunity to eat more. You don't have to make a bracha achrona as long as you, and in general, we have that in mind, that we're going to be eating the karpas, the maror later. And of course, you don't want to overfill yourself because you still want to retain the taste of being ready for that unique taste for matzah. But as a practical matter, that is an interesting moment then to help your guests be able to enjoy the Seder by making it more of an hors d'oeuvres course. And what we learn based on even the change in the questions that we ask at our Seder of the Manish Tana, it has resonance in Jewish history, because what we find out when we take a look at the questions that we ask of the Manish Tana, right, there were changes in the questions that were asked based on what we find in the Mishnah, based on what we find in the Talmud Yerushalmi, to what ended up in our own version. Because it says, one of the things it says in our current Haggadah, it says on all other nights, we don't dip our food even one time. Tonight we dip it twice, right? We say, Shabachal haleilot, einanu matbilim afilu pam echad halayla hazeh shtei pa'amim. If you take a look at the Mishnah, it says on all other nights, we dip our vegetables once. On this night, we dip twice, right? It says, anu matbilim pam echad halayla hazeh shtei pa'amim. So the question is, why did it change that the Mishnah says in all of the nights we dip once, and now our version says in all of the nights we don't dip at all? So I said, some say that perhaps it was because of food customs. So during the Greco-Roman period, the symposiums, and perhaps even at other places, how did people begin their meals? They began with like an hors d'oeuvre. They would take vegetables and they would dip it in vinegar. The other day, I got a really good laugh because I said, Lahavdil, I said, what were some of the food customs that some of us had that we experienced as children at our dinner table? And I said, does anybody remember how often a dinner meal began with a grapefruit sliced in half with maraschino cherries? And I asked the audience, some of them were very young, I said, do you even know what a grapefruit spoon is? Because that's how it helped cut the flesh of the grapefruit. So that kind of has gone out the window. And here, people were no longer dipping. Someone said to me also, they said, well, maybe we do need to go back to the original question that's in the Mishnah because dips are so popular. Dipping has come back. I said, well, it's a little bit of a different kind of dip, but some have said make the first course that people then can have celery, they can have carrots. And I even found there's a source in the Karaganiza that speaks about a tradition at this point for people not only to dip a potato or not only to dip karbos, but to dip eggs in the salt water. Many of us have the custom to begin our Seder, the meal part, doing that, but some I found out have the custom of doing it at this stage. Of course, you would have to make an additional bracha, make a shahakol, but others have said at this stage you can have some bananas, you can have kosher for Pesach Terra chips. So I thought that was like a very creative way, because then again, that kind of takes, so to speak, that takes that issue, I think, off the table, and it allows people to fill up a little bit, that it doesn't interfere, though, with their later necessity to really taste the maror and to also taste the matzah. The other interesting thing, since we're on the topic of original questions, we take a look at the Mishnah. What we find there is that there was a question that said, on all other nights we eat meat roasted, stewed, or boiled. On this night we eat only roasted meat. That question is not in the Manishtana that we say. That question was replaced by the question of that in all other nights we eat either sitting or reclining. Tonight we all recline. So why was that question about roasting dropped and the reclining putting in? And here there are different theories that said that what we know is that the rabbis were very concerned that people not in any way seek to emulate the idea of a Karban Pesach after Churban Bayit. And therefore it would make sense that on all other nights we eat all kinds of roasted meat, but tonight we only eat it roasted based on the Karban Pesach. So the rabbis were so concerned. In fact, tradition tells us we don't point at the zroa, because we don't want to put anything on our Seder plate that maybe we would even think is the actual Karban Pesach, but rather it's just a reminder of it. But the rabbis also tell us something interesting that we find in the Gemara. We find evidence that said someone no less important than Rabban Gamliel said to his servant, like, go prepare. Go prepare. I just am looking for the source. It says, go prepare the kid, not the child, but prepare essentially something that I can roast that seems like Karban Pesach. The rabbis were upset about that. So then there is some theory that not only Rabban Gamliel, but other people were emulating, and they said, this is not something we want imitated. It's interesting because what we've seen in Jewish history is that there were attempts, for example, to try to bring back the sacrificial system in the 14th century. Then again, during the major return to Zion in the 1800s, one of the rabbis had written to Baron de Hirsch to talk about whether there could be funds raised to restore Karban Pesach on the Temple Mount Har Habayit. It was shot down by many, many other rabbis. And then, in fact, what we see even in Israel today is that sometimes there are attempts to try to do that. The courts have not allowed it, but last year there was a story about how a Passover sacrifice just as a ceremony was offered in some cases outside the Horva synagogue or near the Temple Mount, but not actually there. So that is how that question was changed, but how did the reclining question came in? And here too, we see something interesting, because when we look at kind of the impact of the Greco-Roman culture, it was very common for people to kind of recline at a meal that, you know, somewhat connotes royalty. The rabbis, though, explained to us that a Seder might have elements that are similar to the Greco-Roman symposium, but it's completely different, because it's not a bacchanal, it's holy eating. It's not exclusive to men of a certain intellectual level, but it's open to everybody. And not only is it open to women, men and women of every, I would say, background and every economic level, every philosophical level, who was a Seder primarily geared towards? To children, who certainly would not have been at a symposium. But one of those images, and the wine that went on there for us, this is holy eating, this is consecrated eating. So when that kind of fell out of favor just in the general society, then it would be considered much more unusual for people to recline at a meal. I've told the story 1 year before Pesach. I had hurt my back. We were away for Pesach. I was sitting, we had just come in, and I was in such pain. I turned to my husband. I said to my kids, I said, okay, we're really going to be doing mesubim tonight. They said, what do you mean? And we took the matzah plate and we took the Seder plate and we went out into the lobby. It was a kosher hotel. And we were able really to do mesubim on the sofas in the hotel. It was a very, very meaningful experience for my children. They were very young then. So it was extra special. Speaking of like impact on children, in terms of relevance, 1 year I took my children to the Schomburg Museum in New York. Perhaps there are similar museums. There's the Museum, I think, of African American History, Slavery in Washington. I haven't been there yet, but when I took them to the Schomburg Center, they had chains that were on display of how slaves in America were shackled. And I'll never forget the look on my children's face. At that time, my daughter Lizzie was very little. Her eyes just opened wide, because they were chaining toddlers. The chain was not probably bigger than it wasn't even as big as a fist. And it really brought home like slavery. And I think that sometimes the question arises, how much do you connect our experience in Mitzrayim with current manifestations of suffering, etc. And one of the things I have I put in the Haggadah are the estimates today of how many people are enslaved worldwide. Some say 21 million, some say 40 million. It's incredible. In the United States, they estimate that there are about 160 million children worldwide that are stunted due to undernourishment, and that in the United States, over 41 million people live in food insecure homes. So when we recall, because we're told b'chol dar v'dar chayav adam le'ot et atzmo ki'ilu yatzam mitzrayim, we have to see ourselves as if we lived Egypt. It's also an opportune moment to think about just culturally people today who are also enslaved. Even within, tragically, our own community, Agunot, we know about women who are sold in human sex trafficking, refugees who are forced to be on the run. So there are moments where I think we can expand it out. And in thinking about that and expanding it out, just a couple of other things come to mind. There's a beautiful commentary that one can find. It's from the year 1708. It's from the Be'er Avraham commentary on Haggadah. And it says that Rabbi Avram Grant of Prague pointed out that several symbols of the Seder are interpreted to refer to Bitya, the daughter of Paro. And we know that what did Bitya do? Bitya was the one who rescued Moshe. And Rabbi Grata explains that this symbol of washing our hands when we say rachza, because the question is, the first symbol of where we wash our hands without a bracha is called orachatz. When we come to the later, before we eat the matzah, it says rachza. It could have said orachatz again, but Rabbi Grata explains that it's in the feminine, as a symbol to commemorate Bitya's bathing in the Nile. And what did Bitya do? She rescued Moshe with her hands from the water. It's another beautiful reference to the role of women that we recall. The final two things, because I know we want to take some questions, which is also interesting, is that in the Haggadah we see that based on the rabbinic text, it says, what does it say? It says we don't end with afikomen. And I always wondered as a child, that's kind of right. That's a strange thing, because how do we end the official eating part of the Seder? We end with the afikomen. So when you look in the Talmud Bavli and then you look in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's really quite interesting, because the word afikomen is also an unusual word. Some say it derives from the Greek word epikomion, epikomon, which some say means dessert. So the rabbis what we find in the Talmud were saying that after essentially you've eaten the Karban Pesach, you don't end with afikomen. You're not going to break out your sponge cake and your pavlova after Karban Pesach. The last thing you have to eat is that Karban Pesach, right? However, once we no longer had that ability, then the rabbis were brilliant. They took it and they turned it on their head and they said, we're going to end with afikomen, because what is this afikomen when we eat the matzah that the kids searched for, found, that represents, that's to remind us that we used to eat the Karban Pesach. But once you eat that, right, the tradition tells us we don't eat anything after. But when we look at the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's interesting, because when they identified it as also meaning something else, that the word epikomion also means after dinner revelry or entertainment. And what was going on is that it was a custom during the Greco-Roman period that after they had this symposium, after they had this banquet, they kind of moved from one party or banquet to another, and were engaging in, let's just say, we'll keep this G-rated, licentious behavior. So what the rabbis were saying, we don't want you finishing up the Seder and now it's going to be a bacchanal. That's not the afikomen that we want you. Instead, what we want, the last taste is the Karban Pesach. For us, the last taste is the matzah that we've designated as the afikomen. So again, it's a really brilliant inversion that we have of how the afikomen was transformed. The last thing that I want to share with you that I think is very interesting is sometimes I've seen people being critical of the addition of something that we say when we open the door for Eliyahu, that we say Shvo Chamascha. Shvo Chamascha dates to the time of the Crusades, when Jews were hunted down and murdered. There were blood libels. In fact, at the time, some of the rabbis said, don't use red wine because they'll accuse us of using that was the accusation, using the blood of Christian children. They said use white wine, but we do use red wine. We open the door, some say, as a form of bitachon in Hashem, that will be protected, but we say Shvo Chamascha. Some people object to the language because it says pour out your wrath on the nations. Many years ago when I was in law school, I was taught always read to the end of the line. So you can't stop at pour out your wrath on the nations. It says pour out your wrath on the nations that know you not, meaning those nations that don't represent what we hear in Aleinu, that's the Aleinu prayer, that they come under the sovereignty of God and that they are God-fearing. We're talking about people who are hunting down Jews. That's very different than just talking about Chasidei Umot HaOlam. And in keeping in mind with the idea of righteous Gentiles who saved Jews during the Holocaust, even examples, there are some incredible examples of the Muslim who saved the Sarajevo Haggadah at great risk to himself, even Arabs in the old Jewish quarter in Jerusalem that saved the synagogue and really kept it intact until Israel came back in 1967. I included Shvo Chahavascha. Now, Shvo Chahavascha is something that, meaning pour out your love on the nations of the world. Some say, was it made up? Others say it was written and found in a 16th century Worms Haggadah that was written by a descendant of Rashi. But I think that it talks about pouring out our love on the nations of the world who do know God, and on the kingdoms that do recognize God, because it says they showed loving kindness to the seeds of Yaakov, meaning us, the Jewish people. And that we say, may we live to see the sukkah of peace spread over your chosen ones and to participate in the joy of your nations. And I think that perhaps that represents that there's a great deal of particularism at the Seder, as there should be, but we also have in mind not just that we should have speedily soon in our day redemption, but the whole world should come, as we say in Aleinu, should come, B'mheira b'yameinu, also recognize the sovereignty of God. And then when we say Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim haBnuyah, it really can be a true redemption. So it's really been a great pleasure sharing with you some ideas, and I would love to take any kind of questions or comments regarding Pesach, regarding the Haggadah, and regarding the Seder.
Sure. First of all, I want to say that I just learned a lot between the Miriam's cup of water, the Ethiopian Jewish experience until they came to the modern day state of Israel. Even this Shvoch Ohavcha, I think, are all beautiful concepts that really lend a lot of texture and nuance to the Seder. And as I experienced my own Seders this year, I will certainly keep those in mind. Some of the questions that we got were a little more utilitarian. So one of our watchers asked, how can those of us who grew up in not so observant homes make the Seder more than a bunch of boring, her words, not mine, rabbinic texts? She said, I have no fun memories to add or bring, and the few things I found only make the Seder longer since we never seem to skip any of the traditional texts. So what's your advice to her over how to make it a more personally enriching experience? Okay,
so in the Jewish Journey Haggadah, there's a couple of things. First of all, just as a practical matter, the English text we tried to make a little more livelier. It's a gender neutral text. Everything is also transliterated. It's really one of, I think, the few Haggadot that everything is transliterated, because sometimes people feel, even if they're reading along and they, their eyes are scanning the English, they want to feel like they're a part and read the Hebrew. But one of the things I did was I definitely had in mind of trying to have things in here that offer a little bit of a lighter touch. So I offered two things. One, stories that perhaps people can read if some of the traditional things, like they're not as connected to. Some of the stories I shared with you, I included, for example, an experience of a chaplain of how he ran a Seder in Vietnam, which is quite fascinating. But I have here at almost every section really some hysterical parody songs that I think can really make people laugh. If you're a Hamilton fan, I have the Hamilton parody song. If you're a fan of Disney, of Frozen, of Beauty and the Beast, I've got that. I found out who wrote some of these songs that we've been singing for years. Everybody got credited, etc. That can really break it up. I included from a comedy site, Banging Out, like the 10 top reasons why the young man that your daughter brought home for the Seder is not going to work out. That has some really funny, jokes. He brings a challah, as a housewarming gift. There's some things that are a little funnier, for baby boomers who like the song Leaving on a Jet Plane. I have the parody song Leaving on a Desert Plane. People will remember this, some Beatles songs, etc. I think that's also a good way of kind of breaking it up. One of the things I suggest with Magid is that if you have children, or if you have people that are not that familiar with the traditional text, then follow Rambam's Maimonides mandate, which he changed the language. We say Lerot, that we have to see ourselves, right? He says it's Laharot, that we have to demonstrate. So make it a reality program. Go around, interview people. How does it feel to finally be liberating? Tell us what it was like to be building those pyramids. Get the kids involved. There's so many different things that you can do. Bring pharaoh masks to your Seder. Have, yes, when my kids got a little older, they cringed a little that I'm like breaking out the Cleopatra wig and the pharaoh masks. But there is like an element that you want to make it like more fun and more interesting, and that's what Sfardim do. They demonstrated. One thing that I included in the Haggadah as a suggestion, for instance, is that people who have relatives who came from many different places, bring their passports to the table that show the journey. If they hopefully, now they don't often stamp passports, but to see, and it was based on an experience of a family, of a couple with a small child that were separated during the war and miraculously were reunited and ended up with all of themselves and all their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, in Israel. And at their Seder, they would pass around the passports that showed the traveling from Vilna to Vladivostok to Shanghai to Kobe to Lisbon, till the United States, until all the journey got to Israel. That can really spark discussion. One of the things I also include are questions for discussions and different things to kind of prompt not just children to ask the questions, but also to let adults feel that they can ask questions. That's something that Rabbi Isler Salanter said, that when children are younger, you want to encourage them to ask questions because they're still at home and they still have the ability to do so. So those are a couple of, I would say, spiritual and practical ways to figure out if that person picks up the Haggadah. I think there'll be some ideas here that can keep everybody engaged.
Great. So before you had this Haggadah, and maybe still, there's some other, I'm sure, pre-Pesach resources that you look at. Are there other recommendations that you would advise us if there's a specific website or other books? I don't know if you listen to podcasts or other sources that could also, as we continue to prepare for the holiday, to really help enrich the Pesach experience.
Right. So according to sources, there may be as many as 7,000 or 8,000 Haggadot. So that would make mine 7,001 or 8,001. There's a tremendous amount of material online. You can just Google it and you'll find, different supplemental things. One of the things that really I was encouraged why I produced Haggadah was because for years, what I was doing is it took me many years to kind of work on this. I put it away for a long time, go back. But for many years, what was I doing? I was bringing a loose leaf with lots of these different cut and pasted things. And it's a little, it's a little unwieldy. So that it's, good, like to just try something old fashioned, go if you have a Judaica store in your neighborhood to try to go and kind of take a look at it. There are different things for different people. You can give out like one uniform one, and then you can provide perhaps, people can bring a different one that maybe will be of interest. I think the other tip that is very important, it was something that my late paternal grandmother always emphasized, which was as important as it was to observe the holiday, it was also important to have the hachana, to have the preparation. And I think Pesach is that one time. It's not just something that like you can literally plop yourself in and say, here I am. It's very hard, especially if it's mostly women who are doing the cleaning, to like be in two places at once. And by the time the Seder rolls around, you're exhausted. One of the things I suggested is get help. I don't only mean by that, paid household help, but when people say, oh, what can I bring? What can I do? Get them to help you. Meaning if it means like coming in a few days earlier and helping you peel potatoes because it's just so voluminous and you're not going away, that's a way that I guess it's perhaps better than just flowers or another bottle of wine, because those are things maybe you can pick up on your own, but to kind of get everybody involved and of course involve your children. I think the great pedagogy here is getting your kids involved and picking the recipes. One of the things I did also included in the Haggadah were a number of, I thought, interesting recipes to try to appeal to different people. I included a Sephardic charoset. I think that's a great conversation piece because it's different than the regular Ashkenazic charoset. It's interesting when you look in the Gemara and you look in other sources. One of the reasons we were always taught one of the reasons that we eat charoset is to remind us of the mortar, the paste. But we find in the Gemara it's to remind us because of the use of apples under the apple tree with which the women of Bnei Israel had their babies, because they still had bitachon, because of the righteous women we were redeemed from Egypt. So it's almost like there are little things, even in the preparation, become a moment, a pedagogy moment to keep your kids engaged. So, the internet obviously is a great source, but you can have kind of sensory overload. I think that you have to, and also for those that live in the diaspora, hey, take advantage of the 2 nights. You don't have to say everything on the first night. Save it for the second night.
Right. I was just going to add, in terms of getting your friends and your kids and your everybody to help. Somebody made fun of me the other day for having 8 peelers, and I'm like, no, more is more. I can't ask people to help pitch in, help peel potatoes and the apples if they don't have the tools. So we have a full assembly line and people come in and pitch in. It certainly does not fall to one person. It is a village that builds the Seder and a village that participates in it. So I'm a big believer in spreading the wealth of the Hachana. I actually wanted to go back to the recipes thing, because I took a look at the New York Times article that highlighted your Haggadah, and it mentioned 11 recipes. First of all, have you tried them all? And second of all, what is your favorite recipe that you put in there?
Okay, so I've tried them because we've done some food tastings. So I've tried them. We have things like matzah s'mores. We have matzah brittle. We have a delicious banana bread. Obviously, there isn't chametz in it, but it's really so tasty. A very wonderful brisket recipe and chicken, etc. I think my most favorite recipe are actually for those that eat gebrocks, the vodka matzah balls. Now they have kosher for Pesach vodka. It's made from potatoes, so it's certainly within the theme of the holiday, but it also has leeks in it. It has chives in it. It's not as complicated as it sounds. And I think it really adds an extra level of panache. The Haggadah has beautiful photos from Shira HaKoler. You'll open this up and you'll see, oh my gosh, it really makes the holiday, the Seder, Pesach come alive. So kol hakavod to Shira. And the recipes are by Amy Rosen, and they are also just terrific. They were all tasted. We had just done recently an event at the JCC, and everybody, everything was devoured.
Great. I want to go back to one last question on engaging the children, which I think you spend a lot of time on, but there have been a few questions on people stressing out how you engage the 1st to the 3rd graders. So the people who, like the kids who have the Divrei Torah, who, have likely spent a lot of time at school and want to bring it to the table, but maybe sometimes families don't want to drag out the Seder for so long. So how do you strike that balance between keeping the kids engaged and losing them?
Right. So again, utilize the fact, like the kids are eager probably to say everything the first night. So you have to sit down with them and say, let's devise a strategy of what you're going to say the first night and what you're going to say the second night. It might be depending on how many kids you have to kind of figure out the different order. I think you have to also be organized. Even now, we bring a lot of paraphernalia when we're away. We put in a suitcase. People always laugh. And we're bringing pillows. One of the sources also that's so interesting, and it's really something to teach your kids, was that, there's a whole issue about should women be leaning, and very often you'll see women are not using pillows. So what we find in the sources, it said, the only women that should lean are the important women. And it was the Mordechai who said, today all women are important. So that's like a great, I think something really great to use as a source. But again, just I think work with your kids to figure out a good division of what you do the first night, what you do the second night. If you're celebrating a Seder in Israel, it's obviously a little bit different. But that I think that's just something you have to plan ahead of time. It's very bad to try to organize it then. Some people, what they do is they have they have the Seder the first night, and sometimes the second night they let the kids run it. And I think that's a real nachas moment. Again, as long as the adults, are making sure to say all the, even if it's just everything that you're required to say, but the kids really then are the star of the Seder. What more could you ask for? That's a memory that, trust me, when those children grow up, as Ran Hashem, they will remember that. So I think also maybe we just also need to tell the adults, let's all take a chill pill. It's 2 nights a year where, yes, it requires some, a little more effort etc. But there is a reward. That's the reward is not just that we're going to have a delicious meal, but the reward are the memories that are created, and the new memories are created, and the fact that that there is a way to also have fun at a Seder. It isn't just something serious. You can enjoy it. It can be fun. It can be enjoyable. There, of course, there's a heaviness to it, but there's an enjoyment, and that's why we sing, and that's why we do so many things. So let's take advantage of that, especially if you have young children around.
Great. That's a great note to end on. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for this valuable resource. I'm actually going to go online and order a copy for myself, which I meant to do all week and just not have a chance.
Great. So here we are. It's the Jewish Journey Haggadah, and I hope everyone will have a wonderful Yontif, Chag Kasher V'Sameach. And just remember, I hope if you use my Haggadah, that your guests will be so engaged that they will forget to ask, when do we eat? So have a good Yontif, everyone.
Thank you.